What's up, everybody? This is Karak with ACG, and welcome to another HDR primer. It's number 3 today. If you get a chance, go back and check the old ones. If you don't know what these are, they're basically walking you through HDR as it's being implemented in TVs and the consoles, the PS4, the PS4 Pro, and the Xbox One S, and also just what you need to know moving forward and if you should buy something. This is something that I've talked about many times. The HDR primer videos have always been fairly high stressed when it comes to the particular point of making sure that you decide that you really absolutely need it now, especially because media is not really incredibly present at this point. But we do have a little bit that is, and so I want to talk about that today. I want to talk about why we get some reports of people very unhappy with their PS4's implementation in games like The Last of Us, and then I want to talk a little bit about static and dynamic metadata at the end of this video, which is highly important. So if you get a chance, stick around for that, because that is actually the big thing right now, because guess what? Your TV doesn't have it, and it's the last major upgrade to HDR10, and most likely you're going to want it, and you're going to want to know if the TV you're buying is going to be able to be firmware patched for it. So let's jump into it. Thanks everybody for watching the channel as well. So let's talk a little bit about implementations of HDR. The big thing is recently we're starting to get a couple patches for HDR content, and The Last of Us was one of them, and people were posting pictures, which, let's be honest, guys, you can't just adjust all kinds of things like the highlights and the contrasts and assume that that's what a picture will look like. I've seen it in forums where people are like, here's a picture not HDR, and here's a picture with HDR, but I adjusted everything so that you can see what I think is possibly what's being added to the. It doesn't work that way. It just simply doesn't work that way. This is not a situation in which there's even a confusion like a new anti-aliasing technique that makes it difficult to pixel number or pixel count. This is a situation where you truly can't see that data unless you take a picture with something that takes HDR pictures and then put that on some type of imager site, or not even an imager site, upload it somewhere, and then somebody else downloads it and looks at it on their HDR TV. And that's when we get to different displays as well. So we have a lot of people complaining about this. Let's talk about it from 3 different standpoints. Let's talk about it from your overall original history and with that title, because these are a lot of patched titles, from the TV standpoint and from the console standpoint. From your own standpoint, if you played The Last of Us and then turned on the HDR, you most likely had one of 2 reactions, because I didn't really see any middle ground. I saw a couple, but most were like, this looks much better, and most were like, holy shit, this looks fucking terrible. Let's look at it from memory standpoint. You're playing games that were originally created and everybody knew they were going to be on SDR content. They were going to be on SDR delivery methods and monitors. So they sort of prepared that. They knew what they were doing and they got it out there. And that's what you played, right? You played it on your setting and on your TV. Now, who knows if you've got a new TV and this will be the first time you've turned it on? Who knows if this is the first time you've turned it on and you've never played it? And who knows if you played it just a little bit and then did the patch and now you're turning it on the same TV. There's just so many various ways in which you could be experiencing this. But the first thing to remember is that HDR, your memory of what the SDR picture looks like and then what the HDR picture is going to look like, might not actually match up. Now that is talking about you. Let's talk a little bit about the TVs. There's a reason why as well that it could be even more confusing. Some TVs adjust everything when you put HDR signal into it. For example, a Samsung will crank up your backlight and crank up your contrast. Unfortunately, you may have already done some of that inside of the game, okay? That's where there can be some severe issues, because you have a bright, and we've talked about this even on normal TVs. You got a brightness setting in the game and a gamma setting in the game. Do I check gamma on my TV? Do I do gamma here? Do I do half a gamma there, half a gamma there? You know, is it fucking a math contest is what it feels like. It's like I need 6 points of gamma. I'm going to do 4 here and 2 here because that makes sense. But it doesn't. It's very difficult, and it requires you to go into your TV and make a lot of adjustments. Additionally, some TVs do nothing with that HDR signal. They basically just say, okay, great, and then you have to go in there and you have to fiddle with it. Also, some TVs have one SDR setting and one HDR setting. Some TVs have multiple HDR settings. This is where it can be highly confusing for the consumer. And this is something I have pointed out as one of the multitude of reasons in which you really need to understand that if you go into HDR, there's going to be a lot of nitpicking on your side. That's just the way it's going to have to be. You're going to have to do a lot of these settings yourself, and you're going to have to do a lot of study and a lot of research, and somebody else's numbers. God, guys. Somebody else's numbers will not always match yours, because what if they change something in the game? This is ridiculous. I see people who are supposedly masters at this and supposedly understand everything, and they never say what they've done in the game. They're like, well, I did this. Well, that means nothing. What are your exact settings in the game? What's your TV? Because different TVs are certainly going to look different. So you got to understand this. So coming from the TV side, there's a lot going on in that HDR setting. You got to make sure that you go in there and you got to make sure that you have your HDR settings on. You got to make sure that you've adjusted your color if there's an issue with color, and all those kind of things. So very important. Let's move on just for a second to the actual content and to the consoles themselves. So there is an issue we already know with the PS4 implementation of The Last of Us and how it does HDR, and the Xbox One S all the time. So the Xbox One S we know does crushed blacks. This is something that's been known for years. They did it on the Xbox 360, I believe, had crushed blacks as well, where it crushes that data down on black colors and dark colors and makes it really crushy and you lose a lot of data. You are going to have to most likely go in and fiddle with not only the settings in your PS4 or your Xbox One, limited, RGB, that kind of stuff, though probably not RGB. And then you're also going to have to go into your TV and make sure those align. And now we're getting reports that depending on the patch, I guess, or depending on something, some people's settings are opposite. So if they use full, they have to use limited somewhere else. It's just crazy. It's just crazy. And what do I mean by all that? Well, the problem is you're really going to have to get into your PS4. You're going to have to go, or your Xbox One, you're going to have to go into the video settings and you'll see this. And you're going to have to change it on your own while you're looking at the screen. That's just the way it is. So if you've turned on The Last of Us and you're one of the people who says it looks like shit, first thing I would suggest, go into your PS4 and mess around just for a second to see if your color settings have somehow got off. That's the first thing to do. And then, of course, you want to go into the TV second. And the reason why I say that is because normally you want to make sure that your source is prepared before your display. You can do a lot of your adjustments in the display if you want, but if your source is inherently broken and the setting is incorrect, then you're going to end up doing a lot on the display side to fix it. And I think that just ruins a lot of HDR. You know, the more inaccuracy you get in HDR, the more of a problem. So that's from basically the sort of the television side, the console side on the PS4, and the Xbox One just a little bit. This is something that's going to require you guys to go in there and just do a lot of testing and a lot of checking. The last thing I want to talk about, and this one will be slightly short, this video, is HDR Dynamic Metadata and why it's so important. So currently, no TV has this right now, HDR10 Dynamic Metadata. If you have Dolby Vision, that means if you have a TV that has Dolby Vision, and it may also do HDR10, that chip that's inside there actually does dynamic on its own. So let's ignore that for a second. This is just for people who have an HDR10, which is most, and they are seeing right now static metadata for their pictures. What does that mean? The easiest way to describe it is this. You know how a George Lucas Star Wars film looks different than a Michael Mann film? There's different filters. There's almost a different color, or a Deus Ex with its urine filter looks a little different than another game. Consider that the artistic vision that at the very moment the game starts to the very moment it ends, we're going to have this particular filter, right? We're going to have this particular look to the game, particular settings. Makes sense, right? And each director does slightly different settings, each game as well. So what happens with dynamic metadata is instead of 1 to 100 from the start to finish, dynamic metadata allows every frame to be adjusted for better color and brightness and overall just a more dynamic picture, more pop. It's very important, and it is the last true upgrade to HDR10 before you can really solidify HDR10 as its own language, as its own thing. So it still needs that, and that's a big change, and it's one thing that Dolby has, and we're seeing HDR10, they're talking about it, it will definitely be added. What's the problem? The problem is the televisions you buy right now are not guaranteed to work whatsoever with HDR10. We do know that companies like Samsung have said, okay, we'll update it, but we also know that companies like Vizio have 4 different lines. Will some of them do it? Will some of them not? We also know that there's a very good chance that this will require a little bit more from the ACU inside of your TV. Will require a little bit more processing. Will that increase the input lag on an HDR picture? I would certainly assume so. We don't know how much, and it could be 1 millisecond. It could be something crazy low. But even more important, and something that I think people should sort of remember, no one knows. We know that it'll require more, and we know that it'll require a firmware update at minimum, though they originally stated it was going to require a revision to HDMI. Right now, I think that's probably something that a lot of the TV manufacturers are like, no, let's just get it in the original HDR. We'll see if the bandwidth is there. But you have this situation where this is a very good and elegant way in which to display more color and display more brightness and get it really dynamic, which is, hence the word, which is really the best way in which to display HDR. That's what you want, right? So we know that's happening. We absolutely know in 2017 that is coming, but we do not know what TVs will allow a firmware upgrade. There's a very good chance that people who are buying a TV right now will not have the proper experience when they move forward, whether that be a slightly longer input lag or whether that be lack of HDR10 dynamic metadata, which is a huge, huge problem. So, what am I saying? Well, as I always say, there's not enough media right now in HDR for you to move forward. If you're replacing a TV, great. But the fact is that we have tons of old technology like edge lit that are being phased out, thank God. And we're getting to full array. We're going to OLED. Those are very important. But static and dynamic metadata also are. It's really the signal that gets to the TV, and it's what really impacts everything. And that's being updated. It is not a time for you to leap into this technology unless you are somehow guaranteed by some insider that your TV will for sure do it at the input lag. You know, they can say they'll offer a patch. That's one of the things we all need to remember. Anybody can say they'll patch anything. But what happens is the patches performance afterwards, and we already know that HDR does elicit a slightly larger input lag. It is very important that we all take care of that. As somebody who's tested multiple Samsungs, which are known for their excellent input lag, it still doesn't in any way, shape, or form mean that in some way I'm guaranteed that those will just magically work exactly as they do before. It's a huge deal, and it's something that people absolutely need to remember as they move into this Christmas season. So anyway, that's it for me. I hope I answered at least a couple questions. Make sure you fiddle away if you have these systems right now and you're unhappy with your picture, because there's a very good chance you can get something you like. Unfortunately, there are going to be some games as we move forward that will just have a poor implementation of HDR. That's just a given. It does happen. But when it comes down to it, I'm actually pretty happy with where we are now. I'm just not necessarily happy with people having this weird group think where it's like, I bought this, so you should buy it. And they go tell everybody you should just splurge, splurge, splurge. Instead, what we should do is be intelligent, intelligent, intelligent. So anyway, that's it for me. If you guys like the video, give it a thumbs up. If you dislike the video, give it a thumbs down. Peace out and enjoy the rest of your week.